are Riven, Nasus, Yasuo, Jayce, Darius, Maokai, Irelia, Poppy, Kennen, Teemo, Renekton, Fiora, Malphite, Gangplank, Gnar, and then I threw in Tryndamere because I was interested about some of his specifics. So we're going to go through 16 top lane pages, and if your champion isn't covered, you should be able to learn a lot of the lessons here that we're seeing and apply them to the champion that you are specifically playing. You should get pretty close here. So what does Riven do? Well, Riven very obviously wants to run attack damage marks. You could have thought about lethality, you could have even thought about attack speed. The win rates aren't even close. Attack damage is by far the best rune for her. In the seals, you do have some wiggle room here. Flat armor. Oops, sorry. We're done with marks. In the seals, flat armor is actually the winningest one, but also scaling health is pretty close behind. They're within 1% of each other, and essentially, if you're going to be a Riven one trick, I recommend having a second page when you're against physical versus magic damage and switching based on what you're doing. And the basic thought is, even though most champs will use scaling health better than flat armor, Riven has a lot of repeatable shielding and a lot of repeatable healing, which tends to up the value of resistances. She also gets a lot of health and lifesteal in her build, which diminishes the value of health somewhat, which lets armor creep in as the more commonly used one. As far as glyphs, flat CDR won by a lot. Turns out Riven wants cooldown reduction at the very start of the game. It's a really big deal for her, and she cares about that a whole ton. And again, nothing else was really even close. That was very obviously the best one for her. And then attack damage quints were the best for her as well. Attack damage quints are very strong in this champion. 15 AD because everything scales of attack damage. It meant that she could last hit better. It even buffed the value of her shield, which is a really big deal for buffing your attack damage. So this ended up being, with one exception being that maybe you sub this out for scaling health, this is the obvious best Riven rune page, pretty much by a lot. This should be everyone's Riven page, essentially here, and nothing else really came close. As far as masters are concerned, actually 12-0-18 with Courage of the Colossus came up as the most common one, and I think that even after the Courage of the Colossus nerf in 624, it will still be the best Keystone for her, because I don't think she's really good at reliably triggering Fervor of Battle and things like that. Otherwise, theoretically, you could see Deathfire Touch working in some cases, but Colossus was winning by enough that I think Riven stays here and keeps her shield. Let's talk about Nasus. Nasus was interesting because it did not meet my expectations, but far and away his winningest mark was actually attack speed, which will surprise I think a lot of us here, but enough people were using it that it had enough sample, and then it was winning way more than the other runes. Now, I am not a huge Nasus expert. I have two theories as to why. One, if he's playing the big tank build, he doesn't really, care about the raw AD and things like that. And the real big reason I think why this is attack speed essentially becomes cooldown reduction for Nasus, because the more attack speed you have, the faster your attack gets out. Right? And the faster your attack gets out, the faster your Q gets to come back off of cooldown. It helps you make sure you last hit the minion. Now, obviously, raw attack damage actually works for this reason as well, but raw attack damage was like at least 3% lower win rate than raw attack speed. What was interesting is lethality and magic penetration were actually the second and third best marks for Nasus behind attack speed. Magic Pen you think kind of makes sense because you say, okay, well, yeah, one of the common builds for Nasus is to E max, right? And if you're just harassing your opponent out of lane with E, well, Magic Pen is the only way you're going to scale that. And again, it's not seemingly as good as attack speed, but it's there. Also thinking about attack speed as a mark, if you're doing an Emax build and trying to shove your lane and trying to knock down towers, keep in mind, it's actually not correct for Nasus to freeze a lane forever and just farm Q. You want to be pressuring the lane in some form, and that means you want to be pushing up to the turret. You want to be attacking that turret down. You want to be knocking those structures out. You're going to be very big and very durable in a team fight, and one thing we're going to see throughout this entire set of videos is that attack speed is roughly the best mark for tanks, because they're going to sit there with 110 attack damage being ignored, just trying to swat away at you. And it's going to end up resulting in a pretty substantial boost in damage. Lethality, his second best mark, roughly tied with magic penetration. But again, worse than attack speed is because, well, if you're doing big Q wallops, armor pen is better than attack damage for that. So if you really only care about big Qs, lethality is just better than attack damage. But attack speed seems to be the best, and that's what I'm going to say and suggest here. As far as seals are concerned, he's one of the many, many, many champions who cares about scaling health being his best seal. Scaling armor was close behind, and that's based on kind of the matchup you're seeing for yourself. but basically this is pretty good for him. You really shouldn't feel bad about this at all. As far as glyphs are concerned, it's actually a pretty close battle between scaling cooldown reduction and then secondarily flat cooldown reduction. I think no one's surprised about this. He doesn't care about much else other than getting Qs out, getting his R back up off cooldown, and landing withers and landing his E. But scaling CDR tended to be better, and that's just going to be generally true. If you're a solo laner, you tend to care about scaling runes more than flat runes. I don't think anyone's really surprised. And then the reason scaling health works so well is because, lo and behold, Armor Quints. Armor Quints are amazing. You should be running Armor Quintessences on Nasus almost all the time. It's not surprising to anybody because guess what? You'll be taking physical damage pretty often in your games, especially in top lane. Most top laners are physical damage, so there you go. The second best Quint here is Ability Power, but it's quite a bit worse. Good enough for me to write down, but worse enough for me to make the notation that it's not as good. This is the winningest Nasus rune page. Yasuo. Oh, Yasuo. I know a lot of people love playing Yasuo. I like playing him as well. I think he was my first champion to Mastery 5. He's a lot of fun. And a lot of people have had bad impressions of what to actually bring on Yasuo for a while. Now, the nice thing is, it's very easy to get 100% crit on him now, so we no longer have to consider running crit runes, and even then, they probably weren't even correct in the first place. Yasuo's best mark, by far, is attack speed. And I think most Yasuo mains know this, and there's no contest. Attack speed is by far his best mark. It lowers the cooldown of his Q, it gets him more auto attacks in general, which is quite nice. It makes his Q come out faster, which is quite nice. Attack speed just simply is his best scaler by a lot. It's pretty obvious. Next up, actually, in seals, and you might be surprised by this, it actually is scaling health. Now, I know Yasuo's weakness tends to be the early game, and you might think, ooh, I need to kind of buff up that early game, make it a bit better. Doesn't matter. He's a solo laner. Even though he has a shield, scaling health is a big deal. Even though he can refresh the shield, doesn't matter. Scaling health is a big deal. His second best seal is actually flat health. Because if you really are scared about your level 1 and your early game and getting pushed out of lane, flat health is the best rune for that. Period. It is the best level 1 defensive rune in the game is flat health. And if you're really, really, really afraid of your laning phase, then run flat health. But it does not win as much as scaling HP. And that could be a sample bias, because in games where Yasuo's laning phase is really hard, he might just lose a lot more games. And okay, sure, that makes sense. And in lanes where Yasuo's lane looks easy and people get to go scaling health, they win more games. And yeah, okay, that seems to make sense to us, but the point still stands that scaling health is winning a lot more games, and that's what I'm going to recommend here. Yasuo is, unsurprisingly, a solo laner in the top lane. And he doesn't care about cooldown reduction in any way at all, because nothing he does really scales off it meaningfully. Okay, yeah, a couple of his abilities kind of scale off CDR, but really no one cares. So you have the obvious win of scaling magic resist, and nothing comes close here. I think automatically, no matter what, Yasuo should always run scaling magic resist. With no exceptions. This is easily his best glyph by a long shot. As far as quints are concerned, you have two options, one of which is lifesteal. It is the winningest top lane rune for Yasuo. However, it is followed very closely behind by attack speed. And Yasuo is the only champion in the game that I sampled at the very least, whose best quintessence was lifesteal. So, unless you really want to be a dedicated Yasuo player, you can just go for the attack speed, and it's fine. But if you do want to be a dedicated Yasuo player, in the top lane specifically, lifesteal tends to win more for him. And so, since we're doing the top lane pages, this is technically about one more for him, so that's what I'm going to write down. Jayce is the fourth most common top laner. And Jayce, we talked about this a little bit before, is a lethality user, because he's going to be buying a lot of these armor penetration lethality items. He wants to chunk out people. And the math behind lethality, just in general, what the stat means is it multiplies all of your physical damage. Right? It multiplies whatever your attack damage is, it multiplies the base damage of your skills, and it multiplies the attack damage ratios of all of your multiplies the attack damage ratios of your skills. Unsurprisingly, it works that way. No big shockers here. It is followed closely behind by attack damage. If you don't want to shell out for attack damage, or sorry, you don't want to shell out for lethality marks, you can just simply go for attack damage instead, and that's okay. But lethality tends to win more, so that's what we're going to go for here. It's still close. If you don't want to spend the IP, that's okay. It's fine to switch for attack damage instead. As far as seals are concerned, this shouldn't be a surprise. Scaling health is the best. The nice thing is, Jayce is ranged. Jayce isn't going to be taking a lot of damage in his laning phase, typically speaking. Just shouldn't be that big of an issue for him. So you can get away with going scaling health, and it does not take very long to simply survive the encounter, right? As soon as you're like roughly level 4, and I forget the exact number, but it's pretty early into the game, even against physical damage, scaling health beats flat armor very early into the game as far as not getting one-shot by physical damage. And for everyone else in the game, scaling health is obviously far superior. So trust me, this is a very good rune. Otherwise, a pretty significant downgrade would be scaling armor, but that would be second best. Again, you're playing a solo laner. If you're worried about being one-shot by a physical assassin, then running flat armor can be fine. Or sorry, scaling armor can be fine. Let's talk about glyphs for Jayce. Well, his best glyph is scaling cooldown reduction, actually. Scaling cooldown reduction. There we go. Because, unsurprisingly, he is a solo laner, he cares about casting spells, no one's shocked here. Scaling magic resist is not far behind, interestingly enough. I found that kind of interesting, but even though obviously spamming your spells is very nice, not getting one-shot by a phase is also a big deal. In general, I feel like just grabbing a Hexdrinker should make you survivable, but the numbers told me that scaling magic resist was not a bad rune on Jayce, so this is fine to run as well. It's comparable to scaling CDR in general power level. Finally, as far as quints are concerned, attack damage was actually superior, and you'll find this a little bit that the numbers are not, or sorry, I should say the ratios across runes are not always equivalent. So for example, like the amount of lethality you get compared to the amount of attack damage you get is pretty heavily skewed towards lethality for marks. But the amount of lethality you get in quints versus attack damage is not nearly as heavily skewed. So you'll often see lethality on marks and attack damage on quints, and that's normal because that's how the numbers are balanced. If I were designing runes, I'd make them all equal, sort of, the ratio is all equivalent, but that's not what's happened here. So you're going to have a lot of these sort of disjointed one of one, two of the other. And you're just going to see that, and Jayce is one of these examples where the breakpoints seem to be around this part where the win rates tell us that marks are better as lethality and quints are better as attack damage. I think it makes a lot of sense. That's okay. So that's the winningest Jayce rune page. It's pretty good. Fifth most common top laner, Darius. Darius is a very interesting one. Guess what his most common, or sorry, his winningest mark is. It's actually attack speed. And that's going to come as a shock to many of you, and here's why it's actually good. And to be fair, attack damage is second place. It's not far behind. If you don't want to get attack speed marks, that's okay. Attack damage is right behind it. Because even though Darius feels very spell-based, he wants to land his Q, wants to land his ultimate, wants to do all these cool things, and he wants, big attack damage values for his big attack damage ratios. The thing is, he also cares about stacking his passive. And Darius' attack speed growth stat, the amount of attack speed he gains per level, is very, 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 very low. So to compensate, you can get attack speed. And that way, chunk, 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 5 hits, full bleed, huge attack damage buff for getting 5 stacks of bleed on somebody. And suddenly, getting a 5th attack where the other Darius only got 4 gave you a ton of attack damage, a whole bunch more damage, and now your ult's going to land for much more damage because of this. That's a very big deal. It really, really, really is. I know back when Darius was common in professional play, back in the 2015 World Championship, we were seeing attack speed quintessences on Darius. And we probably still will here. I'll show you them in a little bit. But it's worth pointing out that the pros already realized how valuable attack speed was in that champion, but it's even more valuable than they might be thinking. It's actually a very good mark as well. Attack damage is second place, though. As far as seals, interestingly enough, scaling armor actually won out here as far as the winningest rune. A lot of that's just because he's going to be in the melee, in melee range against a bunch of other sort of physical damage attackers. But also, his common build has a lot of raw health on it. He's going to buy Black Cleaver. He's almost definitely going to buy Sterix Gauge. Like, he's going to buy a lot of these health plus AD items. He might even buy Titanic Hydra. And so if you're already buying a lot of health, you still do need to supplement with resists somewhere, and because his core build is all HP, letting your runes cover armor for you tends to help you quite a lot, and it's going to be really nice when, you know, a Jinx or a Caitlyn is shooting at you the entire team fight, and you've got 20 more armor, 25 more armor, and you survive a lot more because of that. Turns out it's pretty good when your build already has a ton of HP on it. Second place, though, is of course scaling health. Flat health and flat armor are not far behind either, but that's kind of the four that you're always going to see is, you know, scaling health, scaling armor, flat health. Those are all usually a little bit tighter, but scaling armor seems to win by quite a bit on this champion. As far as his glyphs are concerned, Darius' best glyph is actually scaling cooldown reduction. Not far behind is scaling magic resist. It's not too far off. Unsurprisingly, Darius wants to land a lot of auto attacks. He wants to land a lot of spells. He wants to do all these things very often, and so, you know, since he has a nice big health pool, he might not die to the mages, and, well, really, I don't think anyone's surprised that Darius wants to just do things more often because he just wants to get to 5 stacks and then start ulting people as soon as he possibly can. Not far behind is the scaling magic resist, though. Being more durable, of course, is quite nice. No big surprises here. And now what's interesting is actually, guess what? Move speed quints are the winningest quintessence on Darius. Because all he wants to do is get into range, land the Q, land the E, catch his target, land the ultimate. He is so range-based, more so than other champions, because all he can do is walk, and all of his abilities are short-ranged. Move speed is a huge sort of empowerment tool for what Darius wants to do. It is by far his winningest quintessence, more than attack speed, more than armor, more than attack damage, more than lethality. Move speed is his winningest quintessence, and that's what I'm going to recommend very heavily to all of you here. And again, if your champion seems like Darius, where move speed and distance is the most important thing, probably going to go move speed quints. Maokai, the 6th most common top laner. Interestingly enough, his winningest mark is actually attack speed, and we talked about this in something earlier, talking about generally what runes are good for. Well, Maokai's passive cares about getting an auto attack off so that he can heal, and as soon as he lands the auto attack, he can start ticking up his passive again. Turns out it's really valuable. Maokai also is a top laner, so he tends to be against other melee champions, and they will brawl back and forth quite a bit. Turns out landing those auto attacks tends to be really valuable. Pretty useful stuff. Attack speed is really good on him. As far as seals are concerned, Maokai has 2 good options. Scaling health is up there. Scaling armor is 2nd place. Those are far and away better than everything else. Maokai is not really going to be killed at level 1. He doesn't really have to worry about that kind of stuff. But being durable later on in the team fight, of course, is valuable. And so, no surprise here, those are what he's going for. These standard tanky runes. As a solo laner, he will level up quickly and all will be well. Scaling cooldown reduction is his winningest glyph. Now, it is followed pretty closely by scaling magic resist, much like we were seeing from the Darius as well, but in a similar boat, right? He wants to land a lot of crowd control. When his ult falls off, wants to get it back up as soon as he possibly can. That's not always going to be a big factor, but it can be. And a lot of people just tend to pick scaling MR if they're playing against a magic damage dealing top laner, and then scaling CDR if they're not against a magic damage dealing top laner. That's totally fine to go for it that way. That's going to be okay. Generally speaking, if your lane opponent isn't that damage type, and you're going to have a lot of health anyway because you're a Darius or a Maokai and you're going to get tank stats regardless, you don't need magic resist quite as heavily to survive team fights, so it kind of makes sense. And then Maokai's best quintessence is armor. I know a lot of people run ability power on this champion because they want more damage with the saplings, they want more trading power, and that's all well and fine, but being invincible tends to be pretty valuable, and flat armor quints are so efficient that they just are his best rune, but actually attack speed is up there as well as flat ability power as good runes. Now, one thing I forgot to do was talk about masteries real quick. I actually took these notes down. I might as well give you these notes. For Maokai, 12-0-18 with Colossus was obviously the winning play right there. For Darius, it was also 12-0-18 with Colossus. For Jayce, we saw him earlier, it was 12-18-0. And Thunderlords as well as Storm Raider Surge were very, very close in win rate. Both were good. And so it's worth pointing out that you really could go for either one, and you weren't going to be wrong, but it was definitely a 12-18-0 as far as his page is concerned. Yasuo, we failed to mention him. He was 18-0-12, and Fervor and Warlord's Bloodlust were very similar power levels. And then finally we had Nasus in the top lane, who was very clearly 0-18-12 with Storm Raider Surge as his best keystone. Of course, he can't trigger Courage of the Colossus in any way, so that's obviously going to be off the table. And just simply put, He's not too hard for him to trigger Storm Raiders, get more movement speed. Movement speed tends to be pretty valuable. Good for him. Let's move on with our pages. Let's go to number 7. Irelia, another commonly played top laner. Irelia, interestingly enough, wins more with attack speed than she does with attack damage, although they are very close together. You can kind of go for either one, and it's not really wrong. Attack speed, though, does win more frequently, and of course it makes sense. She's going to be buying a lot of these sorts of things. She might be buying a Titanic Hydra, might be buying a Ruin King. He-10 style is obviously a big deal because of her W, and just getting attacks in more often just tends to be more valuable. It's really not hard for her to get some raw attacks in. It's just really not that hard. She can use her Q to help last hit under turret. She can warm things up with her R and whatnot. And even though she has some attack damage ratios, again with the Q and R being the specific examples, attack speed still tends to win more on her, a little bit more than attack damage itself. As far as Seals, is actually very tough competition. Mathematically, flat health is actually winning the most for her, although scaling armor and scaling health are not far behind. Really, they're all very close and very comparable. There's actually a pretty significant departure from those three then to flat armor. I wouldn't recommend running the rune in general, but Irelia tends to have a little bit more difficulty in the very early game and then scales into a monster as her W basically doubles itself when you learn rank 1 to rank 2. So he just kind of needs to get through the early game, and then life gets a lot easier for her. That seems to line up with how the gameplay seems to work out. Irelia does need to be a frontliner in the team fight, so scaling magic resist was her winningest glyph. Although it was not far followed by scaling cooldown reduction, flat magic resist for surviving those very scary magic damage lanes, and actually attack speed glyphs weren't far behind either. She's not a huge cooldown reduction user because her Q is going to reset, her W is on often enough anyway. She didn't need to use cooldown reduction, but actually did care about getting even more attack speed because that's her primary damage scaler, so it was actually on the list. One of the very few champions outside of bot lane AD carries who did have attack speed glyphs on the list. But scaling magic resist tended to be her winningest glyph, and I think for obvious reasons, because, well, she needs to be survivable in a team fight. As far as Quints are concerned, everyone's already doing it, but it's attack speed Quints, no big surprise here. She wants to get auto attacks off. E10 style is a very big deal. Getting as many autos as you can during her E stun is a really big deal, and so she cares about attack speed. Getting as many on hits as she can is a big deal. What was interesting is her winningest actual skill build was W max into Q max. It was actually leaving E at level 1 and just being better at getting the Q resets, getting onto your squishy targets, because keep in mind, getting points in Q and getting a Trinity Force can make it very easy to reset off a caster minion and get onto the backliner. And then landing as many W autos as you can seemed to be the most important thing for her. So that was what was important for her as far as skill order. But 12-0-18 Courage of the Colossus tended to be what she was going for and winning a lot with. Even after the Colossus nerfs, she will probably still be going for that. The nerfs aren't incredibly huge. I mean, they're pretty big to be fair, but she'll probably still be a Colossus user after the fact. Poppy, everyone's favorite top lane tank, 8th most popular top laner. Attack damage marks ended up being her winningest mark. They are followed closely by attack speed, because she's a tank. She's going to land auto attacks in team fights and in battles, and actually lethality right behind that, because she tends to be assassinating squishies who you can tend to one-shot with, the wall slam into the Q into your Iceborne Gauntlet triggering, and so she has some, some levels of assassination potential, and it made lethality actually make the list. But attack damage, just as a general rune, tends to be nice for her because she has some good attack damage ratios and was the #1 rune for her. As far as seals, no one's surprised here. Scaling health, we're going to keep talking about it. Scaling health is an amazing rune. It is followed closely by scaling armor. It is followed by flat armor, and it's followed in the near distance by flat health as well. The big 4 defensive runes that we're going to see kind of all the time. But that was kind of the order. Scaling health is going to be the best. It almost always is. No one's surprised here. Scaling magic resist tended to be good for Poppy as well. It was followed pretty closely by scaling... sorry, actually, I take that back. I read the wrong cell. Scaling CDR is slightly better, but it is followed closely by scaling magic resist. Those are the 1 and 2. Again, if you're not worried about the damage you're taking in lane, it's very easy to let yourself get cooldown reduction. And, it turns out getting more Qs, getting more charges, getting more wall slams, that's really useful to have. Finally, armor was her best quintessence. It was followed closely by attack damage as well as attack speed, because those are just general auto attacker, physical damage runes. Those aren't really big surprises, but you know, getting to run scaling health plus flat armor makes it pretty easy to lane and be very durable in team fights, so no one should be really surprised by those being good on Poppy. Now we break away from tanks for a bit and we look at Kennen, and Kennen actually was doing best with magic penetration marks. It's worth pointing out that hybrid penetration as well as attack speed were not far behind. I know a lot of players, pro players, will run those marks instead, and they're not, you know, far off as far as power is concerned, but it seemed like running the flat magic penetration was better because winning team fights is a big deal for Kennen. Being ranged, it made it easy to go for scaling health. I think by far this is his best option. You could choose to go flat health if you're worried about a very dangerous lane, but you really shouldn't have to. That shouldn't be a big deal. But surviving into your mid to late game team fights definitely is important, and that's why scaling health is good on him. As far as glyphs are concerned, his actually winningest glyph, which was very surprising to me, was scaling magic resist. And that I found to be a bit of a surprise, but it also makes sense because if you think about Kennen's build and Kennen's playstyle, he's going to be in the middle of team fights, and he can't always afford to buy a Zhonya's Hourglass very early on. And even when he does, that grants him armor but no other defensive stats. And so rounding out his defensive toolset with some magic resist allows him to be a little bit more durable because he is going to be in the middle of team fights. He wants to be able to withstand a little bit of poke to make sure he can get into the back line, and the numbers told us that scaling magic resist was a good rune for him. Although scaling cooldown reduction was not far behind, and for pretty obvious reasons as well. Now there was actually a there was really no mention of ability power glyphs on him, even though I know a lot of players like to run that rune. It did not tend to win games for him as much as these runes did, so interestingly enough, those are actually dropped off the list, even though conceptually you'd think that ability power would be good on him. It wasn't actually his ideal glyph choice. We move now to quintessences, where it's everyone's favorite, flat ability power, and no surprise here, AP quints are very, very efficient, and they're very, very good. You don't really need move speed because of Lightning Rush and things like Proto Belt. You have your movement very frequently covered regardless. Attack speed was actually his next winningest quint, and it wasn't very far behind ability power because, well, as it turns out, bullying your lane opponents and getting a lot of auto attacks down on them tends to be very effective, and the better you can push your opponents out of lane, the better you are at winning games, and so attack speed was actually pretty close by on Kennen. Now, Kennen was, of course, a Thunderlord's user, 12-18-0. I forgot to mention Poppy, but no one should be surprised. 12-0-18 with Colossus was proper on her. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that, again, 12 points Cunning is basically never used on any tanks. It's very nice to go 12 points into Ferocity, and 18 points in Resolve for things like Courage of the Colossus is no big surprise. But Kennen, he really likes Thunderlords. He really likes the magic penetration. He's a Thunderlords user. 12-18-0 for him. Now, Teemo is actually a pretty common top laner, 10th most common. And Teemo was interesting to kind of break down because he has two very distinct builds. There's the AP Teemo who goes Liandry's Torment, sometimes a Nashor's Tooth, gets a Void Staff in there, maybe a Luden's Echo, things like that. And there's also Tank Teemo, who goes Grasp of the Undying, he gets a Frozen Mallet, maybe a Trinity Force, and, you know, he's just tanky and annoying. Now, both those builds are similarly successful. They win about as often as each other, but it also makes kind of analyzing runes and masters a bit difficult because you start having a lot of crossover there, and you've got to sort of suss out which one is actually better. So we're going to start out by talking about the magic penetration Teemo, and then kind of going into the rest of it. So Teemo's overall highest win rate mark was actually attack speed, which again makes sense. Team is going to be landing a lot of auto attacks on people. Right behind it, though, and very close, was both hybrid penetration as well as magic penetration. All three are very tightly grouped together. Attack speed was mathematically the best one for him. And if you're going for tank Teemo, I think this is easily the best one for you because you're going to be landing a lot of auto attacks in fights. If you're going for the AP Teemo, though, you probably aren't going to use the attack speed nearly as much as you are the penetrations, and so maybe you switch that rune away. Regardless, though, scaling health is, of course, his best seal. We've discussed this to death, so I'm going to let it go for now. And then as far as glyphs are concerned, actually flat ability power tends to be very strong on him. Scaling ability power is not far behind. Now the reason flat AP is getting the nod here is because he is in a lane where his job is to bully people out of lane. And so getting to do that stuff very early on, getting the raw AP to buff up his E damage, that's really useful. So flat AP gets, you know, the slight edge here, but scaling AP is not far away. It's worth noting that Teemo is not really a good scaling or, in general, CDR user because he's very heavily mana gated and doesn't get blue buffs. If you're casting spells on cooldown, you're going to run out of mana anyway, so what's the point of really even getting them? You much more care about the raw sort of damage you're getting out of just simply your E, and that's just going to be doing a bit more for you overall. And then finally, as far as Quints are concerned, ability power was the winningest one, although there were other ones that were close behind. Specifically worth pointing out was move speed and attack speed as similar in power, especially if you're going to play something like the tank Teemo build. You just simply want to stay in range of people and keep your uptime high with things like attack speed. But if you're playing, you know, more of a AP Teemo, you're going to be doing things more like this. And in fact, I'm going to make the executive decision of running magic penetration. Actually, I should actually run hybrid penetration, because this gives you a good mix between your laning phase power with all this damage output, but also, you know, the late game scaling with having some magic pen and having some of the scaling health. And this is what I would actually recommend for not tank Teemo. If you are running tank Teemo, this is attack speed. This is probably attack speed as well. Renekton. He's never really gone. Renekton is a very interesting top lane, and we're actually seeing a lot more raw AD builds on him, a lot more assassin-focused Renekton builds, and that means we're going to see lethality as his winningest mark. Flat attack damage is not far behind. It's not terrible to go for that. If you don't want to shell out for lethality runes, that's fine. You can go attack damage, and it's not far off. As far as seals are concerned, no surprise, scaling health, but the other ones are close behind. Scaling armor, flat HP, flat armor, not far behind, but scaling health just tends to be very good. As far as glyphs are concerned, turns out he really, really loves casting spells, and scaling cooldown reduction is his best glyph. Flat cooldown reduction is right behind on that one, and scaling magic resist is even farther behind. As far as Quints are concerned, attack damage, of course, attack damage is great. Lethality plus AD gives him plenty of AD, lets him really chunk people out. A distant cousin to attack damage is attack speed for quintessences, but we're not as likely to see it. I don't think it's as good, and I don't think anyone should really run that rune. As far as his masteries are concerned, Renekton is pretty firmly going 12-0-18 with Courage of the Colossus. Q then E max is his most successful build, in case you were curious about that one. Just tends to be very, very good on him, and all is well. Now, I failed to mention Teemo's proper mastery builds and whatnot, and actually, Teemo, if you're going for the AP Teemo, is actually 12-18-0 with Thunderlords, just getting, you know, auto Q, auto, and things like that, and triggering it, and that ended up winning a lot more than things like Deathfire Touch, which surprised me. I thought Deathfire Touch was better, but it turns out the Thunderlord seems to be superior on him, unless you're playing tank Teemo, in which it's 12-0-18 Grasp of the Undying, right? You're going Frozen Mallet first, you're going to stay in range of people, you're going to trigger Grasp pretty easily, and you're going to use that to fight people, and that tends to be pretty happy on him. Number 12, Fiora. Fiora, of course, is a primary damage dealer. What's interesting to note is attack speed actually was her winningest mark. Attack damage was not far behind, but attack speed actually worked well on her. So I just think that was kind of interesting, and I wanted to bring that up. But yeah, attack speed technically won a little bit more. I know most people run attack damage. The sample seemed high enough to warrant attack speed being included, and it makes some sense because Fiora is not just going to only land spells on you and trigger her ult and cheer that she's won the duel. She is going to land a lot of autos on you when fighting, and she buys a lot of raw attack damage in general in her builds, right? Maybe a Ravenous Hydra, maybe she's going to get a Maw of Mortius, maybe she's going to get herself, a Bloodthirster in there, a Black Cleaver, things like this. So she's getting a lot of raw attack damage and no attack speed, and when that's the case, as we saw with champions like Darius, getting some attack speed in there is useful, and that is why she has higher wins with attack speed than attack damage, but it's not far off. If you don't trust it, you're not hurting yourself that badly by ignoring the advice. Scaling health, of course, her winningest seal. No big shocks here, but it's not trailed far by flat armor and scaling armor. You could make that choice if you're more worried about your landing phase or a physical damage lane opponent. Scaling cooldown reduction is her best glyph. No surprise there. Get your ult up, get riposte back, land more Qs. No surprises here. But scaling magic resist and flat cooldown reduction were not far behind here. So if you're more concerned about surviving, you can make those choices instead, and it's not too terrible for you. All will be well. As far as Quints are concerned, attack speed was the winninger quintessence, although attack damage, much like Mark's, were not far behind. If I had to make an editorial decision here, and you were really not sold on running 15% attack speed, or sorry, 28.8% attack speed, then do attack damage marks and attack speed quints. I mentioned earlier sort of ratio differences between rune types, and that's what we're going to kind of go for here. Is this was mathematically optimal, but if you're really concerned, switch for attack damage, you're going to be in an okay spot. Fiora was definitely a fervor of battle user, and actually 18-0-12. 12 points for 12 points resolve is very, very good on melee champions. Very few melee champs that aren't supports, and even then support's going to be 18 anyway. But basically, almost every melee champion will go at least 12 points resolve, with very few exceptions. And Fiora is one of those 12-point resolve champions that I would highly recommend you do. She heals a lot. The bonus healing, of course, is very valuable. Oh, I do wish to save. I didn't save my Fiora page. That's what it looks like. We're good to go. But Fiora is still a fervor of battle user. She lands a lot of attacks. No surprise there. Malphite, surprisingly enough, a pretty commonly played top laner, and as a tank, it means attack speed was actually a pretty big mark for him. Right behind that was flat armor marks. I think no one's surprised about that, but attack speed was his winningest mark choice. Being a tank, he's going to sit there for a long time trying to land autos, and that's going to be paying out for him. You might even see him go Titanic Hydra in a late game scenario because his attack speed stats are actually not too bad. Otherwise, flat HP, interestingly enough, was his winningest seal. It was followed pretty closely by scaling health. You're not really wrong to simply go scaling HP, and in fact there was a chance this was simply a low sample size and a bit of variance, and so this is probably going to go very well for you, but in case Malphite's super early landing is a bit rough, then flat HP can give you that little bit of extra edge. Editorially, I'm going to go ahead and say let's do scaling health because I think it's just very easy to work with. But really, these didn't make a very big difference. They're all within 1%. Flat health, scaling armor, flat armor, they're all about the same. And you notice that I'm saying those 4 runes a lot because those are the 4 seals you're basically going to see on every single champion in the game. And you've got to kind of figure out what lane you're playing for, which one you're going to go for. As far as Malphite's glyphs, it's, I think, pretty securely scaling magic resist. Now again, it's still pretty close, but scaling MR makes a lot of sense based on the champion's job, his role. Scaling CDR is not far behind. Neither is flat magic resist, and neither is actually flat ability power, interestingly enough. He actually gets a fair bit of use out of flat AP because, he just wants to land slightly bigger damage spells. I wouldn't generally recommend flat AP, but the numbers were there as a successful rune. Generally speaking, scaling MR, scaling CDR, going to be really solid for you as directionally accurate. As far as quints, no contest, flat armor, by far the best. You're going to run that almost no matter what. Now, Malphite is worth noting. He's definitely going to go 12-0-18 in masteries, but Courage of the Colossus as well as Grasp of the Undying were very close as far as win rate was concerned. Courage, of course, makes sense. If you land your ultimate, you get a shield, but you only get the shield if and when you land your ultimate. That's based off a 2-minute long cooldown. Grasp of the Undying works all the time. You get several triggers of that during a team fight. You will get yourself, the ability to trigger it during your laning phase and whatnot, and so the win rate of those 2 keystones was very, very closely tied, very close together. And after the 6.24 Courage of the Colossus nerfs, Grasp of the Undying is probably just simply the better keystone on him, and that's really no big surprise. Let's look at Gangplank. Now, Gangplank has a lot of different possible options, and it's really quite varied. Now, what was interesting is that, according to the research that I did, his actual winningest rune was scaling attack damage marks, but I can't faithfully recommend buying a rune for one champion when there's other ones that are close together in power. Lethality ended up being really close as his next winningest mark type. Followed, trailed somewhat significantly by raw attack damage, but we're seeing a trend here where the physical spell damage champions tend to really like lethality, and Gangplank is no exception. It's a good rune on him. Attack damage isn't far off. Scaling health just simply is his best seal. And there's really no contest. Everything else is very far away. This is just very good on him. You should be running it so you don't get one shot by mages later on in team fights because you're not buying any HP. You need that health pool somewhere. As far as glyphs are concerned, flat cooldown reduction and scaling cooldown reduction were very closely tied, but flat CDR had the edge as far as what was giving him more wins, so that's what I'm going to recommend here. No surprise. Of course, he wants CDR, he wants more barrels, he wants more parlays, and interestingly enough, lethality was his best quintessence type. Gangplank comes in with armor penetration. He comes in with a ton of raw attack damage already via Parlay, via the barrels, via Trinity Force. You're really not getting a lot of return on investment by getting more attack damage. You are getting significant return on investment by going lethality, so I heavily recommend getting it. Gangplank's best Keystone was pretty easily Thunderlords, going 12-18-0. And it was worth pointing out that getting the cooldown reduction mastery in the Cunning tree was better than getting the armor and magic pen mastery in that tree. Gnar, still somewhat common. He's not winning a lot of games, but he still exists in a lot of them. Attack damage, attack speed, lethality, and armor were all very close as far as marks were concerned, but attack damage was winning the most across those four, so we're going to go ahead and recommend it here. As far as seals are concerned, no big surprise. Scaling health gets the nod, although once again, health, scaling armor, and flat armor were not far behind. As far as glyphs are concerned, scaling magic resist gets the nod here as well, and I think it makes a lot of sense. He's not really that cooldown based. Your ult's only going to be up when it's up, and you've got to transform regardless, so you're not going to be worried about CDR on that very much. I'm sure there's some breakpoint that will let you know how many wallops you'll get, how many Ws you get in a team fight based on CDR when you transform. I don't think it's really that worth figuring out the breakpoints for, so I think this is just very easy and safe to do this. It's also worth pointing out, as we go down to his quintessences, that attack speed was the best one for him, but attack damage and armor were not far behind. If you really want to be tankier, you can do that. He actually had the highest win rate running Courage of the Colossus, which of course can only trigger during Mega Gnar, but really you're not getting that much fervor off on people anyway. You're not really bullying lanes that hard. You're better off being invincible in a team fight, and that's what Courage of the Colossus helps you do, so that's the recommended thing for him. Now, I wanted to look at Tryndamere, even though he's not that common. I wanted to know what he was going to do. He's a very heavy auto attacker. He even gets free attack damage via his Q, so attack speed is easily his best mark. Scaling health was his best seal, although attack speed was not far behind, kind of unsurprisingly. Glyphs, interestingly enough, was scaling cooldown reduction as his best glyph. Getting his ultimate, getting his spins, getting his Q, his W backup tends to be very valuable. Of course, his E scales very hard with CDR because he gets a flat reduction for critting, and so if you chop 1 second off of the max CDR, you're chopping 1 second off the shortened CDR as well, which means it was going to be jumped to 3 seconds, going to be jumped to 2 seconds, and well, that's a really big difference. Attack speed was trailing as the second best glyph, though I don't really heavily recommend it. And then his best quints was actually attack speed. And yes, this means that an ideal Tryndamere page could really be attack speed everywhere in the Rune page. Because again, he gets a lot of raw attack damage and crit. So what's the other multiplier? Well, it's obviously attack speed. This allows him to build up Fury. It allows him to build up the crits. It allows him to do a lot of really good things. And he's going to buy a lot of raw attack damage and crit otherwise. So this is the multiplier he's looking for. It's pretty strong. Now, as far as win rates are concerned, 0, 18, 12 and 18, 12, 0 were very close as far as win rates are concerned. And yes, that meant going Storm Raider, Surge, and Cunning, which was actually his highest win rate Keystone, a Storm Raider Surge. That was my guess coming into the season, and I was right about it. Storm Raider Surge is actually his highest win rate Keystone. And 0, 18, 12 because you've got a lot of these regeneration and various talents in the Ferocity tree that, in the Resolve tree that actually ended up helping him out quite a bit. Surprisingly enough, it helped him kind of survive his landing phase and kind of scale into the game. Even though you'd think 12 points in Ferocity would be a big deal, it wasn't actually quite what you would think. Otherwise, 18, 12, 0 going Fervor of Battle, of course, plenty good, which I don't think is a surprise. And most people were doing Fervor. Some were doing Warlord's Bloodlust, but Fervor is simply better on that champion. And that's what we were kind of seeing on that champ. Alright, that's going to do it for top lane runes and the masteries and keystones they would use. If anyone has any quick questions, I'm happy to answer them.